If humiliation were an art form, my wife's introduction of me to her boss would be a masterpiece. Imagine being referred to as the little husband at a corporate party, while her boss smirks like he's just won a game you didn't even know you were playing. Some marriages crumble under pressure. Mine just detonated in spectacular fashion. Let me set the stage. My name is Ethan, I'm 35, and until recently, I thought I had a fairly normal life. My wife, Lauren, is 33, ambitious, and works as a marketing manager at a prestigious firm. We've been married for 8 years, built a comfortable life together, and shared dreams of a future filled with vacations, a big house, and eventually, a family. From the outside, we looked like the perfect couple. Steady careers, a cozy home in the suburbs, and a golden retriever named Milo, who brought us more joy than most people ever could. But cracks had been forming for months. Lauren started coming home later than usual, claiming that work was intense with the new VP in town. She talked about him often, Richard, the sharp-dressed, silver-tongued British executive with a reputation for motivating his team. At first, I didn't think much of it. Lauren's career was important to her, and I was proud of her success. I even laughed when she said Richard reminded her of a character from a spy movie, smooth and magnetic. Then came the subtle shifts. Lauren started dressing differently, favoring outfits that made her look more polished, more glamorous. She'd spend extra time in front of the mirror before leaving for work and started wearing a new perfume that wasn't her usual scent. When I asked about it, she said it was a gift from a colleague. I brushed it off, assuming it was harmless. That's the thing about hindsight. It always comes with a slap in the face. The corporate party was supposed to be a fun night out, a chance for me to finally meet the people Lauren worked with and support her achievements. She'd been promoted recently, and I was genuinely happy for her. But from the moment we arrived at the upscale venue, I felt out of place. Everyone was dressed to impress, sipping cocktails like they were born holding martini glasses. Lauren seemed completely in her element, gliding through the crowd with ease, introducing me to people I'd only heard about in passing. And then it happened. Richard approached, all charm and arrogance, with a smile that was a little too smug. Lauren greeted him like they were old friends, and then, with a laugh, she introduced me. "This is my little husband, Ethan," she said. The words hung in the air like a bad joke, and the grin on Richard's face confirmed it wasn't just in my head. He shook my hand, his grip firm, his gaze patronizing. I wanted to laugh, to pretend it didn't bother me, but something inside me cracked. Lauren's words weren't just dismissive. They were revealing. For the rest of the night, I watched her closely. The way she leaned in when Richard spoke, the way he touched her shoulder just a little too familiarly, the way she laughed at his jokes like he was the funniest man alive. It was like watching a puzzle fall into place, and I didn't like the picture it painted. By the time we left the party, my mind was racing. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I smiled, thanked her for a lovely evening, and made a quiet vow to get to the bottom of things. If Lauren and Richard thought they could make a fool out of me, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. If suspicion had a scent, it would have filled our house the moment we got home that night. Lauren chatted on about how the party had gone so well, completely oblivious to the storm brewing in my head. I kept nodding, smiling even, but my thoughts were already miles ahead. That night, lying in bed beside her, I didn't feel like her husband. I felt like a stranger sleeping next to one. The thing about moments like that party is they don't just sting. They burrow under your skin, turning every past interaction into a clue you should have caught. I replayed everything. Her sudden late nights, the way she talked about Richard, the extra effort she'd put into her appearance. The more I thought about it, the more obvious it became. This wasn't paranoia. It was a pattern. The next morning, while Lauren went about her usual routine, I decided it was time to act. This wasn't about confrontation yet. First, I needed facts. I work in IT, which means I'm no stranger to digital trails, and let's just say Lauren hadn't been careful. Within an hour, I had access to her work emails and texts, and what I found confirmed what I already suspected. Richard wasn't just her boss. He was her confidant, her lunch date, her late-night strategy session partner. Their messages were all business on the surface, but there was an undertone. Jokes about how well they clicked, compliments that went just a little too far, and a few drinks after work invitations that she'd conveniently forgotten to mention. It wasn't hard evidence of an affair, but it was enough to tell me I wasn't imagining things. Then I found it. A calendar invite buried deep in her work account for a private dinner at an exclusive restaurant 2 weeks from now. Just the two of them. No team, no clients, just Lauren and Richard celebrating some vague milestone. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. This wasn't a smoking gun. It was a cannonball aimed straight at my chest. The next 2 weeks were excruciating. I played my part perfectly, acting supportive, listening to her stories about work, pretending not to notice the subtle lies she told to cover her tracks. But behind the scenes, I was planning. Not revenge, exactly. That's too simple, too messy. No, I wanted something better. I wanted accountability. The night of their dinner, I told Lauren I had to work late. She seemed relieved, which only fueled my resolve. As soon as she left, I got to work. First, I called the restaurant, pretending to confirm my reservation for 2. The hostess was all too happy to help, and within minutes, I had their table location and arrival time. Then I grabbed a small bag I'd packed earlier, my tools for the evening, and headed out. I arrived at the restaurant just as they were being seated. From a corner booth, I watched them like a hawk. Lauren looked radiant, laughing at something Richard said, her hand brushing his arm as if by accident. If anyone else saw them, they'd assume they were a couple. It made me sick, but I stayed calm. The best moves are the ones your opponent never sees coming. At the right moment, I approached their table, carrying a small gift box I prepared. Lauren's face went pale the second she saw me, her smile frozen in place like a glitch in her perfect act. Richard looked confused, then annoyed, but I ignored him completely. I set the box on the table, looked Lauren dead in the eyes, and said, "I thought I'd deliver this personally. Congratulations on your milestone." Before she could respond, I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them with the gift and the fallout. Inside the box was a simple note, written in bold black letters. "Here's to transparency. Enjoy the evening, both of you." Beneath the note was a printed copy of their email chain, neatly folded. When I got home, I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. The real satisfaction came later that night when Lauren walked through the door, her face a mask of panic and shame. I didn't wait for her to speak. I handed her an envelope containing divorce papers and said, "Now we're even." When I handed her the envelope, Lauren didn't even try to open it. She stared at me, wide-eyed and trembling, her carefully constructed persona finally cracking. It wasn't anger I saw. It was fear. Fear of the life she thought she could juggle slipping through her fingers. I didn't say another word, and she didn't ask. For once, the silence between us spoke louder than anything else. She retreated upstairs, and I stayed in the living room, Milo curled at my feet. The quiet of the house was suffocating, yet oddly peaceful. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control. The power dynamic had shifted. No longer was I the little husband she could downplay and dismiss. I had rewritten the narrative, and she knew it. The next morning, I woke up to find Lauren sitting at the kitchen table, the divorce papers still untouched in front of her. Her hair was a mess, and she looked like she hadn't slept. A part of me almost felt sorry for her. Almost. She started talking the moment I walked in, apologies, explanations, promises that things would change. It was a performance, one that might have worked on me months ago, but now it just felt hollow. I told her I wasn't interested. No dramatic speech, no drawn-out confrontation. I just told her we were done, and that was that. She cried, begged, even swore she'd cut ties with Richard, but I didn't waver. The thing about trust is that once it's broken, no amount of tears can glue it back together. And Lauren had shattered ours beyond repair. Over the next few days, I threw myself into preparing for the separation. I met with a lawyer, started splitting our finances, and began packing up her things. Lauren, meanwhile, stayed in the house, alternating between denial and desperation. She stopped going to work, probably too ashamed to face Richard or her colleagues, and spent her days moping around, hoping I'd change my mind. I didn't. But the real curveball came when I got a call from an unknown number. At first, I thought it was a spam call, but when I answered, I heard a voice I didn't recognize, Richard. The audacity of the man was almost impressive. He started off polite. thanking me for the gesture at the restaurant, before launching into some patronizing spiel about how relationships are complicated and how I shouldn't let emotions cloud my judgment. I let him talk, not because I cared what he had to say, but because I wanted to see how far he'd take it. When he finally paused, I simply said, "Richard, if you're calling to defend my wife, maybe you should ask yourself why she's not defending you." Then I hung up. If Lauren thought Richard was going to swoop in and save her, she was in for a rude awakening. A few days later, Lauren finally left. I came home from work to find her car gone and a note on the kitchen counter. It was short, just a few lines about how she was staying with a friend, until we figured things out. I didn't need to read between the lines to know what she meant. She was buying time, hoping I'd soften. But the truth was I felt lighter the moment I realized she was gone. The house didn't feel empty. It felt free. I spent that evening sitting on the porch with Milo, watching the sunset and sipping a beer. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells. I wasn't worried about how Lauren might twist my words or undermine my decisions. It was just me, Milo, and the quiet certainty that I was finally on the right path. But here's the twist. About a week later, I got an email from one of Lauren's coworkers. She wasn't just leaving me. She was leaving her job, too. Word had gotten around about her special relationship with Richard, and it wasn't long before HR stepped in. Apparently, Richard's charm didn't sit well with his superiors when it came to workplace ethics. Both of them were asked to move on. I'd be lying if I said I didn't smile when I read that. Lauren's perfect little world had crumbled, and for the first time, I didn't feel any need to pick up the pieces. She wanted freedom, and she got it, just not in the way she'd imagined. The thing about freedom is that it feels strange at first. Like stepping off a treadmill you've been running on for years. Your legs are still moving, but there's no ground beneath you. That's how I felt in the weeks after Lauren left. The house was quiet, my schedule unburdened by someone else's chaos, but the silence was sharp. Milo seemed to sense it too, following me around more than usual, as if unsure of what this new dynamic meant for both of us. I threw myself into rebuilding my life with the kind of intensity that would have impressed even Lauren's overachieving boss. The first step was reclaiming the house. I boxed up everything that reminded me of her. Photo frames, clothes, the mug she always used for her endless cups of herbal tea. I donated most of it and tossed the rest. It felt therapeutic, like sweeping cobwebs out of my brain. But the real satisfaction came when I redid the bedroom. I'd always hated the pastel floral wallpaper she insisted on, so I tore it down, replacing it with a deep blue that made the room feel more grounded, more me. It was a small thing, but it symbolized something bigger. This was my space now, and I wasn't letting anyone dictate what it should look like ever again. Of course, life wasn't content to let me ride off into the sunset. About a month after Lauren left, I got a call from her sister, Emily. Emily and I had always been friendly, closer than most in-laws, but she'd mostly stayed out of the drama. This time, though, she sounded nervous. "Ethan, I thought you should know," she began, her voice low and hesitant. "Lauren's been telling people you overreacted, that you blindsided her with the divorce." I wasn't surprised. Lauren had always been good at rewriting history when it suited her. I thanked Emily for letting me know and hung up, but the conversation stuck with me. Lauren's narrative wasn't just annoying. It was dangerous. I wasn't going to let her paint herself as the victim while I played the villain in her story. That night, I sat down at my desk and wrote out everything that had happened. The late nights, the emails, the dinner with Richard, the divorce papers. I didn't publish it anywhere, yet, but just writing it down felt like reclaiming the narrative. If Lauren wanted to spin lies, I'd be ready to counter them with the truth. Meanwhile, news about Lauren and Richard had spread like wildfire. Apparently, their exit from the company wasn't as dignified as I'd imagined. Richard had been caught using company funds to wine and dine his favorites, and Lauren had been implicated as part of the fallout. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about power dynamics, unethical behavior, and broken trust. Classic Richard. Lauren's professional reputation was in shambles. She was job-hopping, trying to find work in a field where everyone now associated her name with scandal. I wasn't thrilled to hear about her struggles, but I wasn't gloating either. What I felt was more complicated. Pity, mixed with a quiet sense of vindication. The real surprise came when I ran into Richard at a local cafe. I hadn't planned it. I was just grabbing a coffee on my way to the park with Milo. But there he was, sitting alone, staring into his latte like it held the answers to all his problems. He didn't notice me at first, but when he did, his expression shifted from surprise to something resembling shame. I could have ignored him, walked past like he didn't exist. But instead, I walked right up to his table, set my coffee down, and sat across from him. He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat like a kid caught stealing from the cookie jar. "You know," I said, finally breaking the silence, "I should probably thank you." His eyebrows shot up, clearly not expecting that. "Thank me," he echoed. "Yeah," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "You gave me clarity. You showed me exactly who Lauren was and exactly what I didn't want in my life anymore. So, thanks for that." He didn't have much to say after that, just mumbled something about not meaning for things to get so messy before excusing himself. I didn't stop him. The truth was I didn't need closure from him. I'd already found it on my own. The weeks that followed were a turning point. I started reconnecting with old friends, picking up hobbies I'd abandoned years ago, and even dabbling in woodworking, a skill I'd always admired but never had the patience for. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and that was enough. Lauren's texts trickled in occasionally, each one more desperate than the last. She wanted to talk, to figure things out, to start fresh. I never responded. Some doors are better left closed, no matter how loudly someone knocks. If moving on were a competition, I wouldn't claim first place, but I'd definitely be standing on the podium. Life post-Lauren had settled into a rhythm that felt almost foreign in its simplicity. Work, hobbies, evenings with Milo. Everything felt lighter, unburdened by the constant emotional gymnastics that came with being married to someone who saw life as a chessboard. But just as I started to find my groove, life threw me one last curveball, as if to remind me that stories rarely end neatly. It started with a knock at the door. Not a casual knock either, a sharp, insistent rhythm that made Milo perk up and growl low in his throat. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I briefly wondered if Lauren had finally decided to make one of her pleas in person. When I opened the door, though, it wasn't her. It was Emily, her sister, standing there with an envelope in one hand and an expression that screamed, "This is going to be messy." I let her in, more out of curiosity than politeness, and she wasted no time cutting to the chase. "Lauren's pregnant," she said, the words tumbling out like they burned her tongue. "She wanted me to tell you." Pregnant. The word felt like a foreign object in my brain, something I couldn't process no matter how many times I turned it over. I stared at Emily, waiting for her to elaborate, and she did, but not in the way I expected. "She says it's Richard's," Emily continued, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and disbelief. "But he's refusing to take responsibility. She's spiraling, Ethan. I thought you should know." Of course it was Richard's. The man who swaggered through life with all the accountability of a teenager had finally found his match in Lauren. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so pathetic. I thanked Emily for letting me know and assured her I had no intention of getting involved. "That chapter of my life is over," I said, and I meant it. Emily nodded, looking almost relieved, and left soon after. But the conversation lingered in my mind like a bad song stuck on repeat. That night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't guilt. Lauren's choices were her own, and I wasn't about to clean up the mess she and Richard had made. It was something deeper, a nagging feeling that this wasn't the final twist. And I was right. 2 days later, I got an email from Lauren. Not a text, not a call. An email like we were co-workers exchanging memos. It was long and rambling, filled with apologies, justifications, and the inevitable request, "Can we talk?" I deleted it without replying. But the universe wasn't done with me yet. A week later, I ran into Richard again, this time at the hardware store. He looked worse for wear, his usual smugness replaced by a nervous energy that made him seem smaller. When he saw me, he hesitated, then walked over like he'd just drawn the short straw in a game of dares. "I hear Lauren's been struggling," he said, his voice low. "It's been tough for everyone." I stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or walk away. "Everyone," I repeated. "Richard, the only tough thing for you is deciding which bridge to burn next." He opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off. Whatever mess you've made with Lauren, that's on you. Leave me out of it. And I walked away, leaving him standing there, holding a pack of nails that seemed symbolic of his entire existence. Sharp, useless, and destined to cause pain. The final piece of the puzzle came a month later. I got a call from Lauren's parents, people I hadn't spoken to since the divorce. They wanted to meet, just to talk. Against my better judgment, I agreed, mostly because I wanted closure. When I arrived at their house, I could tell something was off. They looked older, more worn down than I remembered. Over tea, they explained that Lauren had moved back in with them, her life in ruins. She was raising the baby alone, struggling financially, and had even mentioned moving out of state to start fresh. She still cares about you, her mother said, her voice heavy with unspoken hope. She made mistakes, but maybe. No, I said, cutting her off gently, but firmly. I've moved on. Lauren needs to figure out her life on her own. They didn't argue, just nodded solemnly. I left shortly after, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness for what could have been, relief that it wasn't my burden to carry anymore. These days, I think about Lauren less and less. The silence that once felt sharp now feels like peace. Milo and I spend our weekends hiking, and I've started building furniture in my free time. My latest project? A custom bench for the porch where I sit every evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Lauren taught me a lot about trust, about boundaries, and about the kind of life I want to live. And while her chapter in my story is over, the lessons remain. I'm not bitter, just grateful to finally be free. Freedom isn't fireworks or grand gestures. It's the quiet satisfaction of knowing you owe nothing to anyone who once made you feel small. That's the lesson I learned as I stood on my newly built porch bench, sipping a coffee, watching Milo chase squirrels in the yard. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that made all the difference. Lauren faded into the background of my life, like an old song you don't hear anymore. Occasionally, I'd hear whispers about her from mutual friends or catch her name in passing. I knew she'd moved to a smaller town, trying to rebuild after the fallout with Richard. Rumor had it, he'd gone back to England after a scandal at work, leaving her holding not just the baby, but the weight of every bad choice they'd made together. The irony was I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't need to. My closure wasn't tied to her downfall. It was tied to my own growth. Still, life had one last twist to throw at me, as if to remind me that no story truly ends the way you expect. One Saturday, I was at the local farmer's market, an event I'd started attending regularly as part of my new routine. It was peaceful there. Fresh produce, local crafts, and a sense of community that felt worlds away from the chaos of my old life. As I browsed the stalls, Milo tugged at his leash, wagging his tail at a booth selling homemade dog treats. I indulged him, of course. That's when I heard a voice behind me. "Ethan?" I turned, expecting to see a neighbor or someone I knew casually. Instead, I was met with someone entirely unexpected. Emily, Lauren's sister. She looked surprised but not unhappy to see me, her arms full of flowers and jars of honey. We exchanged pleasantries, and for a moment, it was like no time had passed. But then she said something that stopped me in my tracks. "She's not who you think she is anymore," Emily said quietly, as if confessing a secret. "Lauren's trying. She's working, she's raising her baby, and she talks about you more than she should. I think she regrets everything." I didn't know what to say. It wasn't that I hadn't wondered how Lauren was doing. I had, but hearing it from Emily felt strange, like opening a letter you weren't sure you wanted to read. "Why are you telling me this?" I finally asked. Emily smiled faintly. "Because you deserve to know, and because I think she'd want you to." I nodded, thanked her, and walked away, unsure of what to feel. The conversation lingered in my mind all day, but not in the way Emily might have hoped. Instead of reigniting old feelings, it reminded me of how far I'd come. I wasn't the man Lauren had dismissed as her little husband anymore. I was someone who'd rebuilt himself from the ground up, and there was no going back. A few weeks later, I got an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Lauren. The envelope was plain, the handwriting familiar but shaky. I opened it carefully, half expecting another plea for forgiveness. Instead, it was something else entirely. It wasn't an apology, though it acknowledged her mistakes. It wasn't a request for reconciliation, though she expressed gratitude for what we'd once had. It was simply a goodbye. The letter ended with one line that stuck with me. I hope you find the happiness I couldn't give you. And just like that, the chapter closed for good. These days, my life is simple but full. I've started mentoring at a local community center, teaching woodworking to teenagers who could use a creative outlet. Milo remains my constant companion, his enthusiasm for life a daily reminder of what really matters. And as I sit on my porch, watching the sun set over the horizon, I feel something I haven't felt in years: peace. If Lauren taught me anything, it's that some people come into your life to show you what you don't want. And sometimes that's the greatest gift of all. Thanks for sticking with me through this journey. If there's one takeaway, it's this: never let anyone diminish you to feel bigger themselves. Build the life you deserve, and let the rest fall away.